Let's come back to our square of attention. Not a frame of reference, but a square as a geometry of a focus which is not ambivalent but omnibivalent, capable of taking in gunfighter style the entire context so that one can see motion even this far aside, but can be zeroed instantly and can be absorbed spontaneously and emerged in the same way. It's called Zen. We've been looking at why the summer of 2014 is increasingly an enormous pregnant threshold of fertility giving emergence, giving birth in a big way, which is an emergence, the coming forth by day, coming forth by time, form. We have several presentations ago showed this is the first of 3 volumes of the first real translation of the Rig Veda into English, of the first translation of the Rig Veda into any other language than Sanskrit, to the perfection of the ability of decades. The head translator, Stephanie W. Jameson, is at UCLA, right here in town, here in Los Angeles, has done many volumes, and I brought a couple of them here. And in 2014, this translation just came out, and next week, hopefully, I'll show you 3 volumes that just now the 3rd volume brought out in 2014 in the Netherlands, Leiden, Holland, by Brill, on the first calibration of Ajanta caves in India that clears up, like the Rig Veda translation clears up, at least 3,500 years of progressive misunderstandings. The 3 volumes on Ajanta clear up for the first time in almost 2,000 years the incredible story of how the genius of a 9-dimensional complementarity occurs so rare it's like a jewel time in the time forms of civilization, where the creme de la creme has turned into the butter, the ghee, that allows one to have the real sacrifice that now has the efficacy to bring into play that which is so crucially needed, the release from the nightmare, the resolving of what was not only an impasse, but a chaotic cacophony of impasses that became like a swamp, like a dismal miasma. We can do that. With the Rig Veda, one of the earliest presentations of understanding that the Rig Veda had a very special use of language is this little pamphlet, booklet, published in London by Luzak and Company, The Rig Veda as Landnama Book, Ananda K. Kumarswarmi. And this was published on 46 Great Russell Street, 1935. Great Russell Street is where the British Museum is, where Bloomsbury and all of its literary group hung out and so forth. I showed a couple of presentations ago the 3-volume selection of the works of Ananda Kumarswarmi, published in the Voligen series. And it's important, I urged everyone to consider that the Voligen series was conceived by a woman, Mary Mellon, and her relationship with Carl Jung is one of the prized things in this little book that Chiron Publishing puts out. And they're essentially, they were a Toronto Canadian. This is published in the United States, but was for very rare Jung Association members around the world to read in English, limited edition quality things. Mary Mellon was the one who founded the Voligen series with her husband Paul Mellon, who was the son of the great wealthy philanthropist Andrew Mellon. And one of the 100 Roman numeral volumes and sets in the Voligen series is the Mellon Lectures in Fine Art in Washington, D.C., and they're still going on now. There must be into the 50th volumes. The original volume came out in 1943, which I showed last week. But it is the Voligen series that came out in the early 1940s, and towards the end of the 1940s, another woman got the idea of doing a world-class series of bringing together the creme de la creme of the whole planet's heritage to make a series, and it was called the World Perspectives series. Her name is Ruth Nanda, Ruth Nanda Ashen. This one is called Mysticism, Christian and Buddhist by D.T. Suzuki. Daisetsu Tataro Suzuki. Daisetsu in Japanese means humble, most humble. So Tataro Suzuki got the appellation of Daisetsu because he was enormously humble. He lived to be 97 years old in Kyoto. He married a British woman, Beatrice Lane. And Beatrice Lane Suzuki was an extremely wonderful, quiet woman. There are photos of her in her kimono holding her cats. She loved cats and loved D.T. Suzuki as well. The board of directors and editors of World Perspectives, Niels Bohr, Richard Courant, who was one of the great famous mathematicians and histories of mathematics, Hu She, who was one of the great Chinese intellectuals, a close friend of John Dewey and Bertrand Russell, Jacques Maritain, a French Catholic intellectual, J. Robert Oppenheimer, I. Rabi, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, and so forth. You find in this series the same thing that you find in the Voligen series, that the feminine wisdom understands that what is wrong is that the entire nightmare is due to an entire contaminated physiology that leads to a dream-fretting world that has nightmares like reoccurring cyclones going through them, hurricanes going through them, tornadoes going through them, and that there's no end to this unless we wake up. Only that break in the curse, which occurs because the time form is not recognized. It all comes back to the very fact that there is a moment, and that moment is like a trigger. That awakening moment is like a trigger that stops the nightmare because it vanishes. Yes, it leaves a lingering for a while, but the nightmare is over. The burner is turned off. The boiling pot will stop. The whistling kettle will quiet itself down. In Kumerswary's great little book from the mid-1930s, and you have to understand that London by 1935 was being threatened by the Nazis physically in the form of beginning to have the threat, if you do not understand that we are an inevitable Third Reich, we will take you apart in the rest of Europe. He writes about the first sacrifice with capital letters, the Rig Veda being the origin of the Vedas, and that the Vedas are held together not only by the different hymns of the Rig Veda, the 1,028 hymns in 10 mandalas and various other sections, and last week's presentation has a number of those kinds of bits of information. The first sacrifice has been referred to. In the singular, it will, however, be understood that this is in a collective sense. The sacrifice actually consists of many parts and distinct celebrations. In any case, it is by means of this 1,000-year session that the all emanators, in Sanskrit, the Vishva Raja, all of the emanations have a scalar field which can only occur phenomenally in even a universe which can only occur phenomenally of a zero field of nature, Mother Nature, called in Sanskrit Prakriti. I used to call her Ma Prakriti. And Purusha, which is the infinite field of consciousness. When they are eye to eye to eye to eye, one wakens. The nightmare is over. The healing can begin. The first sacrifice is all about that, and is held not only after 1,000 years, but is especially powerful when held after a pair of 1,000 years, an aeon. What about this first sacrifice? All the powers participating in this act of creation, because the sacrifice is for an act of creation, of emergence. And in order for the emergence to occur, the fields must be fertile. And for it to be real, both fields must be fertile, shared. Doesn't matter if you have the ingredients, if you don't have the stove, if you don't have the fire. If Agni is not present, you're not going to have anything that's able to be edible. The occasion of the first sacrifice, it's in, they use the Sanskrit here. It, in principle, is at the beginning of an aeon, the birthday of the supernal sun, the springtime of the cosmic year, when dawn first shone for man. Man is capitalized because it isn't just that there are people. It is that there are conscious people in space-time who are personal, which means that they have emerged out of a quintessential five-dimensional vision space-time into the art of person-making. And that art of person-making is there because at this particular aeon they learn to read. They learn to read a written language, which means that, comme ci, comme ça, someone has learned to write. If someone can write a language, instead of there just being a sound of language, there's a resounding of language in the reading, and you can read it out loud to hear it, but you can read it not so much silently, but internally, so that what occurs then is the expansion of the mind from its frame of references to its square of attention, which can be shifted and opened, and that square can be opened to a field. And that field of vision then, in that five-dimensional quintessential, is the way in which nature wakens to the possibility that we can now have a cosmic sharing. Mother Nature understands that a father consciousness is interested, and interested in her. When the doors of the worlds to come open for you their months and years, and ancient are all these things. And so it is this quality that occurs. And that first sacrifice in 2014 is that the Rig Veda for the first time can be read in English and read out loud in English, and its whole variegated structure can be now appreciated, can be understood, just like at the very same time that this happened, the third volume published by Brill in the Netherlands on the Ajanta caves has been completed. And now we have the Rig Veda and the Ajanta caves available so that we can understand how precious a jewel of a time form that has matured, if someone can read it, if someone can speak it, if someone can hear it. If you have ears to hear, now's the time to hear it. If you have not a third eye, but you have a whole open scalar of nature and consciousness as paired, shared fields, the field of the real is available. Faster than instantaneous, spontaneously. This is what the presentations are all about. And so there are many cognate things. In India, the great pioneering of Malate J. Shenge, bringing the Rig Veda into play in terms of the ancient India civilization. The Rig Veda is about 1500 BC, and some 1500 years before that, the Harappan civilization. Harappa was a huge city of about 500,000 people, and Mohenjo-Daro was even older at about 500,000 people. They were on the Indus River, and that whole civilization spread because They were not after conquest in terms of armies. There was no warrior class in ancient India. That was brought into India by those who were outside of India. In ancient India, one does not find chariots. The whole appearance of chariots is a sign that people who knew about horses and wheels had come into India from outside of India. You do not find horses and chariots in ancient India of, say, 2500 BC. Just like you don't find horses and chariots in ancient Sumer and Akkad, or in Egypt of 2500 BC. There are no horses teamed up in huge teams to pull the blocks for building the pyramids. There are no overseers in their chariots whipping the masses to build those pyramids. Those horses, those chariots, are invented in Central Asia, are made by people that had huge caravan routes that led from the region on the Darya River. It used to be called the Oxus River by the Greeks, all the way to China. Their caravan routes went thousands and thousands of miles through the Hindu Kush, through that curvature of the last of the Himalayas, dropping down into the Gobi Desert, at first in a southern route that went along the mountain range called the Kunlun Mountains, the Dragon Mountains. On the other side of the Gobi are the Tian Shan, the Heavenly Mountains. And the first time that you find chariots in China is the beginning of dynastic China. But 2100 BC. First time you find horses and chariots and jade in China is the first dynasty, the Xia dynasty, which has purposely been kept like a ghost dynasty. We don't know too much about it, they say. We know about the inheritors who displaced the Xia, the Shang, because they were warriors, man. They made bronze and brass, and they were tough. And they were there for a long time. They made their dynasty about the same time that the Rig Veda was written in India, about 1500 BC, but 600 years before then. It's when, for the first time, you find jade, horses, and chariots in China. And also a whole passel full of plants. One of the outstanding plants that was never there in China was the peach. Another was the rose. They were all brought from what we used to call Persia, which were not originally just cultivated there, but cultivated in Central Asia and brought down through what we call Persia into India and across in the northern caravan routes all the way to China. And on the way, because the caravan route went along the Kunlun mountain range, the big city trading post was Khotan, ancient Khotan, where two great rivers came down out of the Kunlun mountains carrying raw jade fragments. One of them had white jade and the other had what is called black jade, a dark spinach green, and the other a very translucent white. And those two kinds of jade were paired with the horses and the chariots and taken into China and founded dynastic China, because there were no dynasties before that. The Age of Kings. So that the whole idea of India and of China, of Central Asia, of the way in which the caravan routes, before there were chariots, before there were horses, extended all the way to the west, the far west, so that one had the development of thousands and thousands of years of persons who had red hair, who went into the far reaches of the west as far as Ireland. And there, about 3200 BC, is the first time that you have New Grange built as this huge place of a first sacrifice that could be offered every year at the longest night of the year, the winter solstice, for the sunrise of the winter solstice leading towards the inevitable. If this sun comes up this morning, spring cannot be far behind. 5,000 years ago or more. It is this quality of understanding that civilization has its time, form, energy, frequencies, and like an energy frequency, it is able to have its shifts in calibration. And so a recalibration that is really monumental is able to take off the frames of reference, to open out the square of attention so that the entire fields of nature and its dimensions and consciousness and its ecology of dimensions can come together in that great transformative third field of the real. Then we have something where we can unseal the glyphic languages of the ancients and understand what it was that they were bequesting. And the true nature is that, like in India, very often, like with the Bollingen series with Mary Mellon, like with the World Perspectives series with Ruth Nanda Ashen, the American woman who founded the first school for nurses, the American woman who founded the Red Cross, that the feminine wisdom is constantly bringing the communities of infinitely expandable conscious natural cycle livers to that threshold where life now begins to have the qualities where it has its fruition, where the fertility is not futility, where birth is no longer an entrance into the nightmare, but it becomes more than just a planet. It becomes a locus of an entire starry system, so that what used to be called chaos, really being plasma, that primordial feminine goddess now has the spangle of all the stars on her body, like Nut, or has the stars made into the points, like Sheshat, who is the goddess who is the way in which the beginnings of written language are refined to be able to preserve life of the person into eternity. That the entrance of a living person into the field of the real, which is eternal, in its 11-dimensional fertility, a real strength theory. It is this quality that the feminine wisdom brings into play, especially in times where a first sacrifice of a new time form must be successful. We know from Ajanta now in 2014 that it had 2 short bursts of a couple of generations each, and that was it. And that the second burst was one of the high watermarks of art in all of world civilization. And it lasted only for 80 years. Before then, it had fallen into great decay for about 200 years from an earlier couple of generations of genius. And after about 3 generations, 25 years to a generation, when the last inheritor king, Harisena, died, all the wealthy patrons that were collected under the aegis of these 3 generations coming to an end with Harisena's death, they all decided to put their money and their patronage and scattered other places that were selfish, and Ajanta quickly was abandoned. And for about 100, 150 years, this or that bandit lord, warlord, would commission little sculptures to be put into fast decaying 30 caves of Ajanta, some of them interrupted mid-carving, and they were not carved in this great flint rock cliff face from the beginning. They were carved from the top because an entire terrace was made into about 100 and some feet, so that you had this huge terrace about 50 feet above where the other rock cliff went down another 100 feet or so to the Warhoga River that carved in this horseshoe this ancient volcanic layers of hard rock from the Cretaceous period, and they bored from the top and made the caves coming as a pivot spinning inside, where they began to carve meticulously the visionary architecture of 2 kinds of temples, one for a presencing of the Buddha in his great Mahayana cosmic expansion of the calibration of nirvana into a maha-nirvana. And the other, those were called chaityas in Sanskrit, and the other is the vihara, where the collection of those who devoted themselves to maintaining all of this, of presenting the ongoing complexity of the sacrifices, and these, all of these. There were 3 great chaityas and 3 more being built when everything came to a close, and all the rest were viharas of communities that also put up those who came on pilgrimage to see. One of the great Chinese pilgrims, Fa Hien, visited Ajanta in the 400s AD. Next week I'll bring a English translation from about 125 years ago of very rare of his travel log. From 400 AD to about 475 AD, when King Harisena died. And Ajanta was not discovered again until 1819. For almost 1,300 years, it went back to the jungle, the bats, the monkeys, the mold, because no one knew how to appreciate what it had shown in its radiance. One can go back to something that is even more barbaric than primitive. because the primitive can always be absorbed into the primordial. One can find a way to go back into nature and become primordial again, like a Thoreau doing his American Indian Vision quest at Walden and learning. Even when all the ground is covered with snow and you can't get out of the door, you can't look through the windows, you can go to the fireplace and you can look up through the flue of the fireplace and see the square of attention of the blue sky that's above the snowy forest. More next week.